Thanks for the introduction. I hope you haven't come here to learn about the Battle of Tewkesbury, because it was a long time ago and no one remembers it properly. They tell you what they think they saw or what they wanted to see, and we try to make it up from there. So I'm going to spend far too long probably going through some of the fossils, if you like, the little shadows that lie around the battle and have come down to us over 550 odd years. So I hope it's not boring, and I hope it all works. If I press this button, something should happen. Yep, there we are. We start off with guessing and gossiping. This comes from the arrival, the primary account of the battle, which has been used very greatly to explain what happened. And even he says it was compiled by a servant of the king's who presently saw in effect a great part of the exploit. So he saw some of it, he wasn't in it, and the rest by the true relation of people who were there. Well, are you going to tell the truth if you did something you didn't want people to know? So that's the starting point. And then James Bennett, who wrote this is just an example, who wrote the second definitive history of Tewkesbury, he wrote about the battle, and he said that about the number of people who died. The Lancastrians lost 4,000 men, others estimate 3,000, but Trussell, who is considered by Malone to be correct in such matters, says the exact number is 3,032. Now, I suspect he's wrong, but I don't know. I mean, he might be correct in those matters. And Mr. Dowdeswell, the Reverend Dowdeswell from Bushley, who did a lot of talking about the history of the area, quite good talking, he said that if local tradition is not positively contradicted by facts, then it's probably right. And that's where we start, really, because don't believe anything. Look for the evidence, look to find out why it might be true. And the oldest inhabitant is a favourite person. There's always some old bloke who's hanging around who knows something about it. And Lieutenant Colonel Blythe, who wrote a really weird version of the battle, said that he based his on some old bloke who said there used to be some sort of fort on top of that hill. So it must have been the castle that John Leyland was talking about. So he had a look and poked it with a long rod, and sure enough, there was masonry under the ground. So he reinvented the whole thing and wrote an academic article about it, which is still in publication, well, still available online. And Richard Brooke, who wrote about battles in 1857, came to Tewkesbury to have a look and found a husbandman working in the garden of the Gupsill who told him that in the Bloody Meadow a few years previously he found a lot of horseshoes and horse bones, which must have been to do with the battle. Well, did they have a lot of horses? It's a supposition there, and why would they all be in the Bloody Meadow? It doesn't make sense, but there we are. And then a couple of years ago, this guy, he was magnet fishing in the Mill Avon and he found a cannonball, which must be something to do with the Battle of Tewkesbury. And it got published in the paper. And it gets in the paper, lots of people will think, oh, that's interesting, we'll believe that. Well, funny fact, there weren't any cannonballs in the Battle of Tewkesbury. There were gunstones, but they hadn't invented cannonballs. And then the interpretation of the evidence. Over the years, things change, and particularly with things like the politics of battles in the good, still politics in battles now, isn't there? But in the good old days, the Lancastrians lost, so the Yorkists told their version of it, and then the Tudors won, and they were Lancastrians, so they changed the history to their version of it, and then they all ran out, and people started looking at maybe more objective, but it was a bit late because they got all these written versions. And the battle lines themselves, Holinshed, who was a derivative sort of bloke, he said that in the battle, the Duke of Gloucester moved back and feigned a retreat to encourage the Duke of Somerset to attack him. And he attacked him forward on. And it was a trap, and they were ambushed and defeated. The arrival, the Yorkist account of the battle, written by the winners, said that the Duke of Somerset left the battlefield with some men, went right around the battlefield at the side, came down a hill, which he previously looked at, and attacked a side hand into the line. So completely different versions of the battle. Holinshed himself was a bit later. He'd copied other people's versions, particularly the second version that was written, and just done a completely different version. He was the man who, along with Hall, who was used by Shakespeare as a source. So Shakespeare is using a slightly different version to the first one. So when we look at the way the battles ran, James Bennet, in 1830, he had everything. That's the Swill Gate at the back of Friars Park. What have we got here? That's the rugby ground. That's the Abbey. So all the battle is on the far side of the current Gloucester Road, and they're all standing behind one another. He attacks, that's Somerset, after Gloucester has moved back, and Gloucester's flanks attack Somerset and envelop them. That's his version of the battle. But Sir James Ramsay, who actually drew a little picture which made it a lot easier to interpret, he had them, as everybody thinks they were, line abreast. The Lancastrians over here, the Yorkists over here, and the current Gloucester Road is just down here. So the Lancastrians are on the Gloucester Road. The Yorkists somehow got around the back, and they attacked and pushed Somerset back using pretty much the same layout. But later, we come to William Bazley, whose version is probably closer to what we believe today or think today than most. He has Somerset attacking from the side, and somewhat a side hand into the King's ward, but that's not the King, that's the Duke of Gloucester. But there we are, what's a little bit of fact? And then attacked from the field. So that's another slightly different version. And then we move on to Lieutenant Colonel Blythe, who discovered the home castle, which up here in where the Borough Council office has been built. This home castle was referred to by a man called John Leyland, who came to Tewkesbury in the 1540s, around about the time of the dissolution. He's doing all sorts of funny things, but he worked for King Henry VIII, and he wrote a lot of topographical information about towns all over the place, and he said that Home Castle overlooked the road into Tewkesbury, and so Blythe thought, if there's a castle in Tewkesbury, why wouldn't the Lancastrians be in the castle? Why would they be out in the open? He disregarded everything that everybody had written and came up with his own complete different version. I don't know if it's right or wrong. I think it's probably wrong because it turns out it wasn't a castle. But Historic England came up with their definitive version, which is very like Bazley's version, but a little bit further back. And moving on to Home Castle. I'm not saying I don't believe anything, I just change it as I go along. Home Castle itself, the antiquarians of the 18th and 19th century thought that as there were a place called the Moats in Tewkesbury, that must have been the moat around the castle. Now that's, the Moats is where the rugby club is now. It was all filled in. The council in the between the wars period, this is the First and Second War, seemed to fill every ditch in Tewkesbury with rubbish from the dustbins, and they filled in the moats with rubbish from the dustbins. But the moats were, I'm going to have to go backward. No, I'm not allowed to go backwards. I pressed the button too hard. Probably the the Abbey fish ponds. And the ditch wasn't a moat at all, it was where the carp lived. And then James Bennett thought they were wrong, that they'd recently dug up some big foundations on the vineyards, a little bit, more or less where the monument is at the moment. They're not there any longer, they smashed them up and used them to make the Turnpike Road. But he thought those were so big that they were probably where the castle was. And then later, people looked at what John Leyland had actually said, and the modern archaeologists had a look at, before they built the council offices, they did an archaeological dig and found something which probably was the castle. But it wasn't a castle at all, it was a large stone manor house. Probably the manor house which the declares as Lords of the Manor used before they transferred up to what's now Tewkesbury Park Hotel location, with when the Dispensers became Lords of the Manor of Tewkesbury. So it was a bit of a ruined manor house. But there we are. And then I jumped a few slides there, I'm sorry. Well, maybe not. But travelling to Battle, they had these very convoluted journeys to Battle. I don't expect you to remember all that. It's just there for a slide. But when people started travelling to the Battle, they told stories. This is an odd story. That's Wells. That's where they feed the swan through the window. There's this strange story that the Lancastrians come into Tewkesbury and getting from Bristol and going to Wells, and the riotous soldiers of the Lancastrians, who were very hard to control, of course they were, they let all the prisoners out of the jail. Well, they possibly did. They do that nowadays, don't they? And they created chaos in the town of Wells, or the city of Wells, should I say. And later, Bishop Stillington, sorry, I promoted him, Chancellor of England, under the Yorkists, was castigated for allowing it to happen. Well, that's wrong on several accounts. Stillington would have nothing to do with it anyway. He wouldn't permit anything like that. And he wasn't there, he was in London. And he never got pardoned for doing it. It's all, somebody fabricated it. It's not in official records, it's in unofficial stories. Ooh, we're pressing the wrong button. Yeah. And another, Elpham Manor. Lovely place on the edge of the Cotswolds at Ely. They've got a letter which was written to them by the Yorkists, the Lancastrians rather, the Prince of Wales, asking them or telling them to send some men to join their army, which has happened all the time all over the place. So they were firm Lancastrians, and they fought at the battle, and their banner will be in the street in the not too distant, probably in Tolsey Lane, I expect. But after the battle, apparently, Queen Margaret's ghost walks in the... That's amazing, isn't it? I mean, on the matter of ghosts, I cannot believe that they're so bright as to be able to make their adjustments for the change in the calendar. And how do they know that it's May the 4th? Because it's 11 days out. But apparently ghosts can. They're doing it all the time. And also, this ghost, the description they gave of the clothes worn by the figure they'd seen walking through the house corresponded exactly with those on the tapestry figure of Queen Margaret at Coventry. Well, it's a lovely figure of Queen Margaret at Coventry. And there's a picture of her. There she is. Oops, oh, I've done it again. Can I go backwards? Well, the Coventry tapestry was commissioned by the Tudors, and it was made in Bruges. There's lots of records of this. It's all written down in receipts and things. It's a lovely thing to look at, but the people who made it had no idea what Queen Margaret looked like or what she wore. And I bet she wasn't wearing all that lovely gold stuff when she was on her way to battle, but there we are. That's it. And then she's got her camp here in Tewkesbury, Queen Margaret's camp. It was called Queen Margaret's Camp, God knows why, but that brought the story that Queen Margaret camped there. Well, she might have done. I don't know that she did or she didn't, but the evidence, it seems, if you think about it, a very strange thing to do, to camp in an enclosure in a field. And the enclosure is a little moated farmhouse. And they're not uncommon in this part of the world. You know, Cowfield Farm, one was turned up not so long ago when they were building a few more factories down there. And there's an archaeological dig looked at it. It's very much the same size, but not as romantic. It used to have elm trees growing all over it and things. And the difference about this one is that on the far side of it is the old road into Tewkesbury. You can still see the sunken way. And there's another one that runs on the far side and runs past the Goodchild. And it's getting close to the centre of the battlefield. But it's Margaret's Camp, and that's what it's called. And you know, popularly, people think, oh, Margaret must have camped there for the night. Or the Goodchild. Why not stay the night at the Goodchild? That's even better. I don't know that she'd say, all right, I get a bit tired now, wake me up when it's time for the battle and go off and have a good night's sleep. I don't think anybody would. If you see, he's much closer to the time than us, Shakespeare's Henry V, before the Battle of Agincourt, he's walking around talking to the troops and nobody's sleeping, they're all getting a bit anxious. I don't think I'd get a bit anxious about what he's going to do the next day. I don't think I'd be able to sleep. And I don't think Queen Margaret would either. But there we are. She's got to sleep somewhere. But it gets better as we come on later. Oh, am I not good at this? And then also in the journey, these are the Yorkists now. The Yorkists are on their way to Tewkesbury. Queen Margaret, well, they don't know they're going to Tewkesbury. Queen Margaret says to them, by message, that she will fight them at Sodbury. And so they camped in this large fort, Iron Age fort at the top of Sodbury Hill. The problem with Sodbury, to me, as a mere observer, is Margaret's down there, and you've got to go down the Cotswold Edge to get to that. So how are they going to fight? He's up here, she's down there. He's got every advantage under the sun, you'd think, unless they do this polite British thing and, wait a minute, we'll go down the hill first before we fight, or we'll let you walk up and get your breath and then we'll have a fight. Who knows? But it says it's supposed that they were there, but they say a skirmish took place between the army and that of Queen Margaret in the neighbouring town of Chipping Sodbury. That's in the arrival. That Margaret had sent some troops forwards to pretend to be coming to do battle, and they met the blokes who were going to find some lodgings for King Edward, and they had a skirmish in the street. And you can see, again, nice old photo. It's a bit closer to the time of 1471 than today, but it does show there's no cars there. It's a nice wide street, and in the distance up there, you can see where the King Edward is. Well, it just seems such an improbable thing. But I've got no better explanation, I'm afraid. And then they come to Cheltenham. The army, 6,000 or 7,000, approached the town via Painswick, Birdlip and Leckhampton. And they said to arrest you for a few hours on the site of the gasworks. There wasn't a gasworks there. This is local papers. And local papers didn't appear until the late 18th century. And they're full of all sorts of stories. And a lot of the time, they're recording what people knew or what they thought at the time. So it's the first time that you get the folk memory being recorded. And I get a bit obsessive with local papers because they've got such weird and interesting stories in them. But who knows? I doubt if they were anywhere near where the current gasworks is. There isn't a gasworks anymore. Anyway, it's a superstore. Tesco's, I think. There they marched to the outskirts of Tewkesbury the following morning where a battle was fought. That's fair enough, I suppose. It's probably some truth in that. But that's probably how they went. And it's interesting, a couple of interesting things here is King's Ditch. Now, they say in the local papers that King's Ditch is a memory of the king walking along through that way. But I'd love to know what the real meaning of King's Ditch is there. In most towns in Britain where you've got a King's Ditch, and probably Shrewsbury's a good example, is they are part of the defensive system. Well, Cheltenham never had a defensive system, and Swindon Village certainly didn't. But so, why is it called King's Ditch? I mean, that was a bit interesting, isn't it? Well, I think it is, but there, I'm a nerd. And in the parish website, it says that they passed along through the village what is now Runnings Road and dog bark loud on his way to the Battle of Tewkesbury. They probably did, because that takes them to the Swillgate River, and walking along the side of the Swillgate River is a sure way of getting to Tewkesbury, without a map from the AA to show you how to do it. It's the way people went, probably. And they said, after a short rest, he took his men through Swindon and Stoke Orchard to Tredington, where they encamped. Edward spending the night in the old parsonage, a house now partially swept away. Probably was an old parsonage, I don't know, but it was only a chapel of rest in 1471, so it certainly didn't have a parson. There would have been a lord of the manor there somewhere, I expect, so there might have been a manor house where he might have spent the night, possibly did, somewhere in Tredington. But Stoke Orchard, say, the village in medieval days was known as Stoke Archer. There's a clue, isn't it? Archer, battle, nah. Archer was the name of the family that owned the village. And legend had it that Yorkist King Edward slept in the village the night before the Battle of Tewkesbury. So, two villages, both say he slept there. We tend to Tredington because it's a bit closer and it fits the arrival version best. Sudeley Castle, they're my favourite. This is making history as on the hoof. They discovered the body of King Richard III in a car park, and Sudeley Castle thought Richard III used to own this little edifice. His brother gave it him in 1469. So as he owned it, he must have come here and slept the night. They publicised this, a big press release. I wrote to them and asked them, oh God, this is great, can I see the evidence? Because it seems unlikely to me. And they said, well, there's no evidence, it just stands to reason, doesn't it? And on their website now, which you can't read, and I'll read to you, it says, during the Wars of the Roses, Edward IV of the House of York came to power, and Boteler, a Lancastrian supporter, was forced to sell Sudeley Castle to the king. Sudeley Castle was now royal property, and Edward IV granted it to his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who held the estate for 9 years, using it as his base for the Battle of Tewkesbury. So he was popping over. I don't suppose he used a bus, but how do you get from Tewkesbury to Winchcombe? Easily. It's not doddle, is it? Up Nottingham Hill and over the top. Well, who knows? But I bet it didn't happen. You want to go home every night and say, I've got to go and have a kip at Sudeley Castle. I don't think so. And then David Franklin of London, who's doing a thesis for his MA degree on timber frame buildings, summed up the results of studies continued over a period of months. This is a talk to one of Tewkesbury's learned societies in the 1956. It's not that long ago. And he said the evidence that he uncovered cast doubts on the belief that the Duke of Clarence planned the Battle of Tewkesbury in Clarence House. Well, I could have told him that, because I don't think it had been built at that time. But it gives a name and it gets an association, doesn't it? Maybe Warwick was in Warwick House, but he was already dead. Bewdley's quite good, because I think there is some fact in it, that Bewdley became a royal manor, and it was royal favour because there are archers in Bewdley who joined the Yorkist cause, and before, about 10 or 15 years before the Battle of Tewkesbury, they'd helped out a lot in one of the earlier battles of the Wars of the Roses. And a lot of archers, they say, joined the Yorkists as part of their force. Lots of people did, so there's no reason to doubt that. But after the battle, the inhabitants of Bewdley had done such service, the king gave them a charter, and became a chartered town, like a borough like Tewkesbury. And Richard III built the bridge for them. That's nice of him. That's not the bridge he built. They had a nice bridge with a chapel on it, but they built a new one for the traffic. And Lord Wenlock. Now, Lord Wenlock, according to the arrival version of the battle, he was a Lancastrian who failed to support Somerset, and he had his brains smashed out by the Duke of Somerset in the middle of the battle, just dead on the battlefield. But the problem is, he's no body. He's not buried in the abbey that we know of. He's not among the nobility buried in the abbey or mentioned of the abbey, except that he was killed. He's not listed as being taken thence for burial, and he's got St Mary's Church in Luton was his own base. It was only a little place in those days, Luton, and he had a castle on the hill outside, and he built a big chapel, and he's not in the tomb that he built for himself. So there's a bit of a mystery about him, and a local man wrote a book about the mystery of Lord Wenlock. He got obsessed. He's related to Lord Wenlock's wife, and he came up with this theory, which is great, that Lord Wenlock had faked his own death, and that they deliberately put it about that his head was smashed in so nobody could recognise him. And it happened with other people, it happens in battles, doesn't it? And they dressed somebody else in his livery and said, oh, that's Lord Wenlock there, we'll bury him. But he wasn't buried. And he skedaddled and disappeared off to London and joined the nobility again. But that's unlikely as well, isn't it? Because how come the Yorkists wouldn't twig that, wait, that's Lord Wenlock there? They knew him because he'd been on their side once. And Adrian's view is based on the fact that, that's interesting, that as they were coming to Tewkesbury, the Lancastrians stopped at Glastonbury, and Wenlock left his treasures with the Abbot of Glastonbury because he didn't want to lose them. And after the battle, his wife Agnes went down and redeemed them. She got them back off the Abbot. But being good Christian men, the Abbot wanted paying for looking after them. So they wrote a receipt which listed all the items, and that receipt is in the documentary records now. And those items appear in another will from Wenlock, who died in Baynard's Castle in the 1840s, in the 1480s, get it right. They're very much the same things. So Adrian's theory is it's the same Lord Wenlock. I don't know, but it's intriguing, isn't it? To make a good detective story for the telly, but not from Adrian's book. It's not all that readable. And the Bloody Meadow. Here, sir, close by is the Bloody Meadow, the long strip of ground, brook running through it, fringed with osiers, where the slain lay in heaps and the water was reddened with their blood. That happens on every battlefield. There's always slain laying in heaps. There possibly were. And the river possibly did run red with their blood. I think it's been altered quite a lot since those days, the battlefield, but it's always had a little sign on it saying that it was the centre. And it's called the Bloody Meadow for a reason, isn't it? We don't just pluck that out the air. So it probably was closely associated with the battle. This is a long one, isn't it? This is from a walk into the battlefield, a gentleman walking in to look at the battlefield. We arrived at the Field of Blood, situated but a few hundred yards from the outskirts of the town. They always like to talk about the last sanguinary Battle of the Roses, terminated that protected. The language is much better than journalists today. And the site, the brave Queen, was to some extent altered about 20 years ago. So it was altered about 20 years ago. Then it says, during the excavations, a large number of cannonballs and other relics of ancient armoury were found. Well, if they were, where are they? Nobody mentioned them at the time. And this was 1854, but 1834. You'd think somebody would have said, but no, nothing. And in the Abbey, two versions. Because the abbey kept their own diary, so to speak, and one of the monks wrote down what he thought happened. And it's all come back to us. It's in the Bodleian Library now as part of the Abbey Founders book, which has recently been published, so it's there for everybody to see, in translation and in original. And it says that the maddened army of King Edward entered the monastery and the town, despoiling very many people. That's what soldiers do, isn't it, when the red mist is in front of their eyes, and then afterwards they regret it for the rest of their lives. Violently laid hold of the wretched men from the army of the aforesaid prince and killed them, both in the cemetery and the church itself. Well, that wasn't in the official Yorkist version. That was just what the Abbey wrote. I don't think they have any bias in the Abbey. And there's a wonderfully Victorian representation of it. And interestingly, the story was that someone with the sacrament got between them and stopped the fighting. And in the official history of Twinning, the village, based on Twinning the family, Richard Twinning, who was the deacon of the abbey at the time, was that very man who stood between them and stopped it. He might have been, but we don't. That's the only place that says it that I've found. How do they know? They made the tea as well, incidentally, but that was later. And the other version is that they fled into the abbey in great numbers, and Edward sort of went along and knocked on the door and said, "Excuse me, there's some people in the abbey I want." And they had a discussion with the abbot, and he said that he'd give them his free, he would give them his free pardon if he handed them over. But they agreed that the abbey didn't have the franchise, the freedom to give sanctuary to the king's traitors. Well, that's a fact, that in the old laws, you could claim sanctuary for anything you liked, except treachery. The king's treachery to the king, there's no sanctuary for. Everything else, you can get sanctuary. So there's a truth in that, as long as he was the king and as long as they were traitors. And interestingly, to me, at Bosworth, they use exactly the same thing, but from the other direction. New king, new traitors. So if you're on the other side, you're a traitor. And I'm sure they're doing it today. And the battle thus done and achieved, the king's grace was largely shown, and so in the abbey and other places in the town. So they brought all these Lancastrians together from both the abbey and from elsewhere in the town. Now, every account of the battle I've seen says they all came in the abbey. So the Duke of Somerset was carrying in a corner of the abbey before he was arrested and executed. He might have been in another corner of the town. He might have been in the cellar of Clarence House. Who knows? There's Woolston Church. 2 soldiers from the Lancastrian army fled the battlefield pursued by Yorkists, heady with victory. And they murdered them in the church. And the proof for that comes from some consecration crosses, that the church was reconsecrated, and they put these little crosses for reconsecration. That one is in the chancel on the window side, and that one's outside on the back on the tower, a bit more weather-worn. Now, there might be a relationship between those two things, but it's a bit tenuous to me. And there is another one which I think is more famous and even more tenuous, and that's Didbrooke. It was here the Lancastrians, fleeing from the Battle of Tewkesbury, sought refuge, but were hauled forth and put to death by their Yorkist pursuers. The west door still bears evidence of this affray, holes made by bullets fired during the struggle. Well, I've got a couple of problems with that. The first is that this church was allegedly so despoiled that the Abbot of Hales had it pulled down and rebuilt. And it was pulled down and rebuilt, but the other version had said it was falling to pieces. Nothing to do with them. And if they pulled it down and rebuilt it, why would they reuse the door with bullet holes in it? And why would they shoot them with bullets when it was not a very advanced art. And bullets were just little balls of lead that you put in these very strange and very slow and difficult to burn guns. Arrows would even more like it, but there we are. Those bullet holes are still there. You can put your fingers in them. They're lovely and round. They look like they're drilled more than it's intriguing why they're there, but I don't think that's what they are. And there's in the north wall there's a tomb consisted of a stone coffin. Some said that it was a tomb of the founder. Others say that it was an abbot who fled from the Battle of Tewkesbury, was overtaken at Debunked and there killed and buried. So Debunked are having it both ways. They've got two things happening. But I don't think there were many abbots who fought at the Battle of Tewkesbury, to be honest. There might have been one or two, I don't know, but they're not recorded anywhere else except at Debunked. And he's the unknown abbot. And then it's conjectured that Stoke Orchard was the place of retreat of the wounded soldiers at the celebrated Battle of Tewkesbury. On the farm of Mr. Hone, I think he was the auctioneer, there is a field where many skeletons have been found, their heads perforated and associated with military implements. Well, that was in 1862. If that was the case, you'd think there'd be more than just a little report in the paper about it. The perforated with military instruments is interesting. If you know about the bodies found at Towton, we've got little holes in the backs of their heads where they've been executed with axes. Yeah. But Stoke Orchard is a funny place for it to happen. They want it both ways, don't they? King's Lynn, well, this is a good one. They were given this from their local paper. They were given lots of relics from the Battle of Tewkesbury, which had been dredged up from the river before, where they were dredging the Severn before they built the lock. Now, they probably were given those bits and pieces that were dredged up from the river, but were they from the Battle of Tewkesbury? Everything that's found that looks a little bit military is from the Battle of Tewkesbury, apparently. The sad thing is that this happened in 18 something or other, 47. Yeah, just about the time, just before the weir was built. And King's Lynn Museum have lost all trace of those. They didn't even know they had them. So it'd be nice to have seen what it was. But you're often disappointed when you go to museums and find things that came to the Battle of Tewkesbury, unfortunately. I'll be doing this right. And then upwards of 400 unfortunate soldiers in a field still known as the Bloody Field were driven into the river. And when dredging operations on the Severn first took place in 1842, that's the time, skulls still contained in the iron headpieces of the period, pieces of armour, weapons and other relics of the battle were found. They're the same ones, aren't they? It's probable that when the discoveries were dredging is resumed, they'll find some more. So when they were dredging the river, they found lots of stuff. They undoubtedly did. There's lots of stories of that. But was it the Battle of Tewkesbury? Was it the Civil War? Was it nothing to do with anything? You don't know. And Prince Edward, interesting death. Who knows how he died? It says the arrival says, in the winning of the field, such as the bow hand strokes were slain incontinent. I bet they were. Edward, called Prince, was taken, fleeing to the town wards and slain in the field. So they say that he was taken and killed in the field. And incontinent means impatiently, incidentally. Not anymore. But there's a shop. Willis's shop in at the Cross, number 102 Church Street. And a lady, Honor Clements, who is an Evesham lady, and her memoir, or her memories, appeared in a book which was published for the millennium called Evesham Voices. And she was an old lady who was talking about her youth. And she said that she was working for Mr. Willis, because her family came from Tewkesbury before she got married and moved to Evesham. And she found a brown, she was sent to a room on the first floor, a storeroom, and there's a stain in the floor. And she said, "What's that, boss?" And he said, "Oh, we don't want to know about that. That's a blood stain from the murder of the Duke of the Prince of Wales. Get it right, my head's going funny. And all the scrubbing in the world won't remove it. And it's a good story. Holyrood House have got a similar one about some Italian bloke. That's in Scotland, of course. But they did remove it, because when the co-op bought it and turned it into the co-op stores in the 1950s, they knocked it down. There's a little bit of floorboard in the museum which says it comes from King Edward House, but it isn't the one with the stain in it, unfortunately. There we are. Can't win them all. But it's a good story. There he is being killed, and there it is today. It looks like pretty much the same as it was, especially on the upper floors, but it's just a pastiche nowadays, unfortunately. But they weren't too bothered about the blood stain on the floorboards in official circles or in the co-op. Death of Prince Edward. The murder should have period of ghostly visitations on the night of the 7th of May in every 7th of May notice in every year. A funeral procession passes by our door at the midnight hour with a murdered prince, the Abbey bell tolling at the time. So every year there's a ghostly funeral procession goes past, and it's the Prince of Wales. And it was told by an old inhabitant named Charlwood, who represented himself as having been the actual witness of the occurrence yearly for some time. Well, if that's the Charlwood who Charles Wood Alley is named after, he was the landlord of the pub opposite. So, you can make your own conclusions on that one. And then there's the grave. It's there. It's nice. This is all stuff. When they were altering the church, they wanted to lower the level. They moved the choir back when they took out the roof and all that, and lots of Georgian alterations. And so it was in the way, so they took it out and smashed it up a little bit and put it aside. But there's a man called Dingley who wrote his book on history in marble. And he came to Tewkesbury Abbey and he did a few things. He included this, oh, God damn it, I have to do it again. Sorry. He included a sketch of the tombstone. And it's the only record we've got of it now. All the brass had been picked out, he said. But according to a newspaper report, the tombstone was took up and left by the north door for a while at the side, and eventually it was used as flooring on the north side of the tower, which is underneath the Abbey verger's office. But they've got carpet on the floor, so you can't see. Oh, that's annoying. But there we are. Queen Margaret's flight. Tradition says in her extremity, Queen Margaret forded the Severn, her horse being guided by 2 monks. Who said that? That was Cecilia Cooper, who was writing a poem about it in 1820, and that was her footnote. First time it's ever been recorded. But it's considered a fact nowadays. And this is interesting. Stories of Queen Margaret. They cut down a tree in Bushley. Sorry, I should have said that previous one was Payne's Place, where she was supposed to have spent I can't go back on these things, where she was supposed to have spent the night before she ran away to Little Malvern, not Great Malvern, Little Malvern. But also, a tree blew down in 1959, a great big oak tree in Bushley. That's not it, that's still there in Corks Hill, but it's a nice tree, isn't it? And the newspaper said that this was a tree which King Charles was supposed to have hidden in. Well, got up a lot of trees. And also, another story, possibly true, is that Queen Margaret of Anjou sought refuge in the tree after her defeat at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Well, trees, they're little to start with, aren't they? Before they get old, so God, it must be really old for Queen Margaret to have hidden in it, and it blew down in 1959. But there we are, that's trees for you, stories. And her flight, there you are, that's the other priory, Little Malvern Priory. In my view, it's one of the most romantic views in Britain. You come out of Anley Swan and there it is in the distance, a lovely little place, and she's supposed to have been caught there, but was she? If you cross the river at lower load, getting to Bushley is not easy. And if she's shown how to cross it by two monks, wouldn't she have gone to Forthampton because that was the abbot's summer palace, or whatever abbots had? And Bushley, there's no direct route. If she crossed at upper load, she's there, straight into Bushley. So she might have crossed at upper load, but she couldn't ford at upper load because there wasn't a ford there. So mysteries, mystery after mystery after mystery. And anyway, other people say different things. So Edward Hall, who was he was the third person to write an account of the battle in the late 15th century, just after the Lancastrians the Tudors had taken the throne. He said the Queen was found in a chariot, half dead with grief at the sight of her forlorn affairs, without knowing what would become of the prince her son, and was brought back in that condition to King Edward. Nothing about houses of religion. And Miss Strickland, who lived in the big house up at the top of the hill, she said that she was carried in a state of insensibility to her chariot by faithful attendants and was conveyed through the gates of Tewkesbury Park to a small religious house hard by. Well, some people say that's Deerhurst. Well, that makes a bit of sense, except that it's going back to the south rather than to the west, where you'd expect her to want to go, or the north. It's going the wrong way, isn't it? But Deerhurst is not considered a good possibility now by modern writers about these things, but it's there. It could have been. Don't know. And Bredon, Sylvia Charlwood. This is my collection. This is I got. She told me this story that when she was a kid, they said in the playground that the little row of old cottages, now demolished, of course, in Bredon, that Queen Margaret hid in the attic. And as the Yorkists approached, she escaped through the roof and crossed the Avon and then escaped. Well, she could have done. She was crossing the Avon to Twin Inn would have been straightforward. And that might be a place she went. But it would rewrite a lot of history if that were the accepted fact. But it's not. And this is God knows how this story came. Blanche Heriot and Neville Audley. Neville Audley, the story goes, there's been poems and plays written about this. It's in Chertsey on the Thames, near Runnymede, near Epsom. And Neville Audley, who, as far as we can see, never existed, they say fought in the Battle of Tewkesbury for the Lancastrians. And he escaped from the battle, and he was going home to Blanche, his betrothed, and he was getting very close, and he was captured by the Yorkists within sight of her, almost, and he hurriedly gave his ring off his finger to one of his servants and said, "Go and give that to the king, because I've done some favours to the king, and he'll let me off if he knows that it's me." So this bloke went rushing off with the ring to see the king, and they captured him and thought, you're a rebel and a traitor, so we're going to execute you when the curfew bell tolls. Now, they had a curfew bell because Chertsey had been burnt down, so they had to have a curfew to tell people to put out their fires at night. And Blanche was watching for this, and it was getting close to the time, and these blokes were coming out to ring the bell, and she saw her messenger coming across the ferry across the Thames, and he was almost there, but not quite there, and they were going to pull the ropes on and so she rushed up to the top of the tower and hung onto the clanger so it wouldn't ring. They were trying to ring it, it wouldn't ring until this bloke got there. I brought his pardon, and so he got let off. And they all lived happily ever after. Now, why would they tell that story in Chertsey? It's a bit weird, but there we are. Could be a play that could be produced in Tewkesbury, that, because it's written. And art and literature. getting to the end now. Phew, thank goodness. This is the tapestry at Coventry. Not a very good picture because there's a heck of a lot of it. Well worth going to the St Mary's Guildhall in Coventry. It's the nicest bit of the city, that's left. And this tapestry, it's been done as a sort of propaganda item for the Tudors because it shows all these Yorkists and Lancastrians around about from the Wars of the Roses, and all the Lancastrians are looking holy and looking at the altar, and all the Yorkists are looking sneaky and looking in the other direction. It's great. And then there's lovely painting, Sir John Gilbert. All these paintings are in the Guildhall gallery in London, and that's supposed to be Queen Margaret's escape, but it's not, is it? Got a nice picture of the Abbey in the back, but it hasn't got a spire. Sir John didn't know it needed to have a spire. And also, they're all on horseback, and would they be on horseback? Doubtful. But it's nice, it's romantic, and it's got some nice clouds. And there's an opera. They used it as a front cover, and the opera is supposed to be very good, but it isn't performed very often. And then there's literature. Lots of long romantic poems written about the battle. Margaret Holford. Malvern Chase, the book. It's a great book, but I wouldn't rely on it for truth. But it's a rip-roaring story. And then there's Cecilia Cooper's excruciating poem, it has to be said, but it's got some good illustrations. And then Mr. Pereira's story, The Battle of Tewkesbury, which he wrote a few years ago. So there's quite a lot of fiction and interesting conjecture about the battle, as there is in modern accounts. I think this is my favourite book on the battle, Peter Hammond's Battle of Tewkesbury, which was written about 50 years ago now. That one, which is available in all good local bookshops. That one, which Peter Gravitt wrote, which is all right, I suppose. And then this one, which will be published for Christmas, which will be not so much concentrated, well, it will concentrate on the story of the battle, but on some of the things that wrap around it as well.